Hi, this is Andy Hoffman, Marketing Director of Miles Franklin Precious Metals in our 26th year in business. It's midday, Thursday, May 14th, 2015, and the title of this week's audio blog is 106 in a 50. Now, by far, audio blogs are the most mentally draining part of my job. And this from someone that works 24/7 watching the hideous political, economic, and financial carnage caused by a handful of sociopaths intent on stealing as much of the world's wealth as possible, causing untold financial and social damage. Not to mention the fact that the tools of their trade have been focused squarely on not only my personal assets for the past 13 years, but my business livelihood. Frankly, my daily articles are therapeutic and podcasts an excellent means of venting angst. However, neither compares to the intensity of audio blogs, which I first spend several hours scripting, followed by 20 to 30 minutes of taping. The writing process is extremely free-flowing, with no pauses to charts, links, or research, and taping takes the whole emotional outflow to a new level. Afterwards, I couldn't feel more uplifted, particularly given the strong positive feedback I received. However, whilst going through the process, I drain a lot of mental energy. Irrespective, I wouldn't trade what I do for anything in the world, as not only can I speak at will of topics I feel very strongly about, but I can help others to understand what I have culled in over 26 years in an increasingly terrifying financial world. To that end, I have much to discuss this morning. Shockingly, with precious metals up for the third straight day, despite all manner of cartel capping and attacking attempts. Clearly, something extremely ugly is on the horizon, as since last week's audio blog, Tectonic Market Shifts Portend Disaster, said shifts have grown more violent, amidst an explosion of ugly economic data, political events, and of course, the mystery sellers of global sovereign bonds that are driving worldwide rates relentlessly higher, amidst the weakest economic environment of our lifetimes and the largest global debt burden in history. Oh, the powers that be are doing everything in their power to slow the runaway train of global economic collapse from entirely derailing, like in the Bank of Japan and the Swiss National Bank's cases, overtly printing up money to buy stocks, which, by the way, is what I said they were doing long before they admitted it, and in fact is exactly what the Federal Reserve is doing here covertly, as well as the ECB in Europe and likely the PBOC in China. Heck, the US government is so desperate to slow the interest rate train down, it actually reported, get this morning, an April PPI depicting the biggest monthly collapse in 5 years. Yes, with average US gasoline prices having risen by 4% during April, and by the way, another 4% in May, the BLS, already infamous for publishing its monthly NFP employment report, actually reported Americans' cost of living declined by 0.4% in April, compared to expectations of a 0.2% increase. Of course, all these numbers are comically understated to start with, in that the real monthly rate of inflation, as calculated by John Williams of Shadow Stats, and lived by everyone reading this blog, is closer to positive 0.7%. Ironically, the BLS simultaneously this morning published the lowest weekly jobless claims number in, drumroll please, 42 years, which frankly makes said inflation numbers appear relatively sane. My friends, until the economy permanently collapsed in 2008, investors could not care less about weekly jobless claims numbers. Or for that matter, most of the statistical garbage published by the government, let alone the various statistically insignificant, rigged diffusion indices published now by public companies like Market and ivory towers like the University of Michigan, who, by the way, have both been caught selling such information before publication. However, given that jobless claims numbers are more rigged than ever and downwardly biased not by an improving economy, but horrifying secular factors such as the permanent shift toward a part-time, low-paying, non-benefit accruing jobs, they not only are essentially irrelevant, but have a perfect correlation with the plunging labor participation rate. In other words, it's no coincidence that the lowest weekly jobs claim number in 42 years, seasonally adjusted of course, is occurring whilst the labor participation rate is at a 38-year low, and for men only, far more than 38 years. Don't forget, before the gold standard was abandoned in 1971, real wages were high enough to enable one-income families, allowing women to stay home and rear children. But how about that? Nearly exactly to the date Nixon reneged on Bretton Woods, female labor participation exploded higher, just as senior citizen labor participation is today, given how few Americans have any savings at all, let alone enough to retire on. And by the way, do you know why so many Americans are working part-time these days? In many cases at wages at or near the minimum level? Countless factors play contributing roles, but the most significant are the disappearance of America's manufacturing base, in large part due to trade agreements like GATT and NAFTA, which were lobbied into law at the expense of millions of Americans, as well as an explosion of business-suppressing regulations and socialistic policies like Obamacare. I knew I was onto something when I voted for Ross Perot in 1992, at the mere age of 22, but who could have known, just 2 decades later, the giant sucking sound he was ridiculed for highlighting would shift from Mexico to China. Of course, these ugly trends were turbocharged by the collapse of Greenspan's fiat currency-driven economic and asset bubble at the turn of the century, and accelerated to hyperdrive when global peak debt was hit in 2008, yielding the commencement of a potentially multi-decade liquidation process that has spawned draconian anti-capitalistic legislation, expanded capital controls, heightened geopolitical tension and social unrest, and of course, the final currency war, which when all is said and done will not only cause all currencies to collapse against gold and silver, but lose most, if not all, their purchasing power. Not to mention such gross financial and economic deformation that financial assets have been goosed to record high valuations amidst record low fundamentals, precious metals have been suppressed to record low valuations amidst record high fundamentals, and global industrial and infrastructure overcapacity has become so enormous, deflationary price trends are nearly guaranteed for years to come. Except, of course, for need versus want items, which in an environment of historically high and exponentially expanding debt levels will be catastrophic, let alone when the financial repression policies, both overt and covert, causing multi-millennial lows in interest rates is inevitably overwhelmed by economic Mother Nature and the unstoppable tsunami of reality, at which point the term financial Armageddon, frankly, will still understate the case. No, today's headlines are decidedly not about labor market improvements, not to mention the fact that even the BLS's infamously fabricated NFP employment reports not only scream labor weakness, but get uglier with each passing month. The first quarter's historically ugly GDP report, featuring barely positive GDP based on a fraudulently understated GDP deflator, as well as the largest inventory build in U.S. history, is far more constructive in describing where we are today. And despite the propagandist's incessant insistence that America has been recovering for a record 6 years, hard data across the board clearly states we are back in a 2008 type of environment. Only this time, debt is exponentially higher, financial valuations in record territory, and central banks completely devoid of ammunition, having long ago taken rates to zero and maxed out their balance sheets with toxic assets. To wit, yesterday's horrific April retail sales report, during the spring when the weather can't be blamed, was validated today by ugly sales numbers from Kohl's and JCPenney, stores where the debt-burdened, savings-deprived 99% shop. This is probably why the Fed's own tracking models expect second quarter GDP growth to be not much different than the first quarter, or for that matter, Europe, Japan, and even China if economic data was reported truthfully. And aside from the painfully obvious, in my view PPT-supported crude oil and copper markets, which irrespective are down dramatically from their pre-2008 highs, nearly all commodities sit at multi-year lows, including telltale industrial sensitive products like coal, steel, iron ore, and lumber. Of course, not all commodities have equal fundamentals, and if the horrific California and Brazil droughts don't reverse quickly, the world could be in for a food inflation holocaust of epic proportions. Unquestionably, the entire world is already in a recession far worse than 2008, and given the aforementioned factors and countless others, the odds of improvement are not even slim, but none. And then there's that little country called Greece, which with each passing day draws closer to the inevitable default of most, if not all, its 400 billion euros of debt, which will likely catalyze a daisy chain of individual, corporate, municipal, and sovereign defaults the world round. Not to mention the potential collapse of the world's second largest currency, as well as the political and economic union behind it. To that end, I'd say it's incredible how no one is discussing the potentially cataclysmic ramifications of this week's UK election. But heck, nothing surprises me anymore. As you know, the UK has for decades poisoned the world with its sinister financial policies and corporate imperialism, not to mention its own population with the Bank of England's relentless printing press. However, even if the initial reasoning was simply to retain control over said printing press, at least the Brits were smart enough to avoid the mad euro currency experiment. However, they are still part of the European political and economic union, which quite obviously provides a boon to overall European trade. That said, the combination of European political instability, the potential Greek collapse, and a dying continental economy is causing UK citizens, and politicians alike, even those in Scotland, which nearly left the UK itself, to consider whether it wants to remain tied to the ECB-captained economic Titanic. To that end, this week's decisive Conservative victory puts the issue of a potential Brexit on the table on the front burner, with the possibility of a citizen referendum on this issue now possible as early as next year. If the citizenry votes yes, it will provide a dramatic blow to European trade. Not to mention, it will drive the costs of global trade to measurably higher, as increased regulations, tariffs, and other protectionist policies exponentially expand. To that end, recall my 2015 forecast audio blog, in which I specifically stated in a prediction titled Revenge of the People that, quote, given the expanding pace of global economic contraction, I expect revolutionary movements, in most cases peaceful, to explode upon the scene in 2015, even in places as civilized as France and Italy. At some point, one or more of these referendums will have cataclysmic global ramifications, be they in Greece or elsewhere. Which brings me to the principal topic of today's audio blog, i.e., how sociopathic central bankers that have temporarily taken over economies and financial markets alike are reacting, and what they are likely to do as the irreversible global crisis accelerates. Which brings me back to the aforementioned derailment of the economy, caused in large part by the reckless, suicidal policies of a handful of unelected economic psychopaths, as depicted in real life by this week's incredible Amtrak derailment, in which a completely sober conductor actually increased the train speed to 106 miles per hour around a sharp curve with a 50 mile per hour speed limit, causing a fugitive-style crash resulting in hundreds of casualties. Not that central bank lunacy, starting with its ringleader, the Federal Reserve, which still issues the world-destroying reserve currency, isn't a topic I haven't devoted thousands of hours to already. However, it is the singularly most lethal threat the world faces today, as well as the greatest source of opportunity for precious metal holders. It thus needed to be discussed further today, particularly given the aforementioned tectonic market shifts it is creating, portending a potentially very near-term, historically cataclysmic crisis. In my mind, it all goes back to the fall of 2011, as discussed in my Point of No Return article. At that time, central banks realized their deer-in-headlights, historically reckless emergency liquidity programs, such as TARP, were decidedly failing, as stocks were collapsing, dollar price gold was hitting a new record high, the pigs were on the verge of imploding, and even the U.S. government's, ridiculously undeserved, AAA rating was stripped. At that point, the powers that be decided to not only commandeer all financial markets, but do so covertly with weapons of mass financial destruction like over-the-counter derivatives and market rigging algorithms. They also commenced the historic wave of ZIRP, NIRP, and QE programs that continues today unabated, igniting a global currency war that is rapidly accelerating the collapse of the House of Cards worldwide fiat currency Ponzi scheme. Since then, despite the Fed printing more money than anyone, the average currency has collapsed by more than 40% versus the dollar, and far worse percentages for the Fragile Five nations where more than a quarter of the world's population resides, as well as the mighty BRICS, that are supposedly the new global economic engine. LOL. Brazil, Russia, and South Africa economic engines? India with its collapsing rupee and suicidal government? Or China in the early stages of what will turn out to be the most spectacular bubble implosion in history? If this is what the world's economic engine is, I'd hate to see what the other parts look like. Yes, said final currency war results in stronger issuers, such as the Fed and ECB, which issue the world's most liquid currencies, exporting inflation to the rest, which in turn erroneously believe their only choice is to print more money themselves in an attempt to inflate their economies in the same manner as the consumer prices already strangling their populations. Thus, despite the aforementioned global currency collapse, notwithstanding this month's relatively minor counter-trend move, central banks have been easing monetary policy like never before. I mean, think about the lunacy of lowering rates when your currency is collapsing, which is exactly the opposite of what logic would tell you to do, given that lower rates only weaken a currency's appeal. However, the world-destroying, tragically flawed Keynesian theory that printing money creates wealth effects by inflating asset prices and increased manufacturing market share by making one's products cheaper has become the political mantra of the day, despite hundreds of years of empirical evidence proving otherwise. Not to mention the corpses of all 600 previous attempts to expand economies via fiat currency expansion. Of course, as we are seeing today en masse, that is, essentially every nation on earth, the hyperinflation of financial markets is only benefiting the 1% directly receiving such largesse, whilst for the 99%, the only benefits received are higher consumer inflation, lower employment, and lower real wages. And oh yeah, not a single nation that has employed such policies, Japan being the poster child of such failure, has either materially increased its manufacturing market share or improved its trade balance. In turn, we are now living in a scary world featuring the weakest economy since the 1930s, the highest level of geopolitical tension since World War II, the highest ever consumer price inflation, and the largest debt edifice the world has ever known, expanding at an exponential pace. As for the markets, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize something very, very ugly is afoot, as exemplified by Societe Generale putting out a report this morning asking if 60 billion of QE can't get the euro down, let alone the 1.1 trillion promised in the next 18 months, then what's next? Yes, the euro is actually rising against the dollar despite its own horrific political and economic situation, featuring a potential Greek Grexit any week. This should tell you all you need to know about how poor the United States' financial and economic situation is, as well as just how broken the so-called financial markets have become. And then you have the pink elephant that even the MSM and Wall Street can't help but noticing, even if the PPT refuses to allow stocks to respond in kind, which is the relentless global interest rate surge despite unprecedented central bank monetization efforts, which threatens to destroy said debt edifice like a nuclear bomb over Hiroshima. Is it Chinese treasury bond selling causing the decidedly terrifying turn of events, ironically as it expands its own historic QE efforts? Or is it the so-called bond vigilantes finally starting to discount the inevitable hyperinflation that's coming? Or is it something we don't yet understand, although frankly it's difficult to believe another force exists that's powerful enough to overcome the cumulative effect of relentless central bank money printing and monetization. That said, I'll tell you one thing it's decidedly not because of, which is, of course, Federal Reserve rate hike fears. Not that raising the Fed funds rate by a measly 0.25% would have any impact whatsoever on anything, aside from financial market valuations, which would plunge given that the only thing supporting them, aside from the PPT, are multi-millennia low rates. That said, the Fed hasn't spoken this dovishly since initiating QE3 in late 2012, and given not only the exploding tsunami of horrific global economic data, fears of what might happen in Greece, and countless other black, gray, and other colored swans circling the waters, not to mention the fact that rates are already rising, I'd put the odds of a 2015 rate hike at somewhere between ZERP and NERP. Which, by the way, is what the Miles Franklin blog has said since the Fed pretended to end QE 8 months ago. To the contrary, the Fed is doing everything in its power to push rates back down, such as noted above, making sure today's PPI was laughably low, or, as was the case the past 2 weeks, contributing to 3-year and 10-year Treasury bond auctions featuring the highest indirect bids in years. In other words, they are QEing more today than ever, and as I wrote in January 2014's 3%, enough said, the higher rates go, the more maniacal their covert monetization efforts will become, the more dovish their public statements, and the more likely U.S. economic data will conveniently weaken. However, if the sum total of these manipulations, including blatant cartel efforts to suppress precious metals, which as you can see are starting to fail, continues to fail, the Yellen reversal we have long predicted will hit the world like a bolt of lightning, as when Whirlybird Janet finally admits it's time for a new, overt QE scheme, undoubtedly of a far greater magnitude than all previous QE schemes, and God forbid negative interest rate policy, the global economy and financial markets will experience volatility and ugliness like never before. And oh yeah, gold and silver prices will literally explode, potentially destroying the Fed's salvation operation before it can even get started. In other words, global central banks are currently running the monetary expansion equivalent of 106 miles in a 50-mile-per-hour zone. And sadly, as history's largest Ponzi scheme rapidly moves toward the end of its terminal phase, they are all but guaranteed to ramp the throttle up exponentially until inevitably every fiat currency is destroyed, which is to say, every fiat currency. And given the aforementioned tectonic market shifts occurring today, don't be surprised if said speed ramps up in the coming months, if not weeks. To that end, if you are considering the purchase or storage of precious metals, we hope you'll call Miles Franklin at 800-822-8080 and give us a chance to earn your business. And as always, I can be reached via email at ahoffman@milesfranklin.com. Thanks and have a great weekend.